that was it. The Acolyte. A show that spawned more memes than Disney Plus views, stoked the fires of fandom hate, and for some solidified Star Wars' position as content rather than event. But was it really that bad? This was the first attempt from Lucasfilm at a new Jedi story since the sequel trilogy. Yes, we've had Obi-Wan Kenobi and Ahsoka, but this was the first attempt from Lucasfilm to tell a new Jedi story rather than lean on characters they already had. So in this video, we will take a look at The Acolyte and make the case that it was not actually that bad, and in fact an important step for Lucasfilm in righting the wrongs of their last Jedi-led story, the much maligned sequel trilogy. That in The Acolyte we have a step in the right direction, with the right strategy for the future of the Star Wars franchise, but with at times terrible execution that simply cannot justify its incredible production budget. And to support my case, I will be drawing on a world-first data analysis of the Acolyte and Star Wars sequel scripts using generative AI text processing to identify the strategic themes and narratives in the story, so that we can see things we couldn't see before, amidst the cringeworthy blooper reel of misses in the experience itself. And don't worry, we'll cover those too. So let's get started. First, let's briefly cover a fundamental question. Was The Acolyte a success or a failure? Well, the numbers to answer that question are hard to come by, and Disney themselves have not been forthcoming to help us understand the audience they captured. But if we look at the publicly available Nielsen streaming ratings, we can see The Acolyte is not a success relative to the Star Wars Disney Plus shows that preceded it, and surely not in the context of the reported $180 million production cost. With Nielsen ratings, the currency is minutes viewed, and Nielsen only released the weekly top 10 shows, which incidentally The Acolyte did not appear in from the 4th episode onwards. If we divide the number of minutes viewed by runtime per episode to get an estimate of the number of views, it is the second lowest Disney Plus show on record. And while it's an imperfect estimate, we can also look at these views as a proportion of the total claimed Disney Plus subscribers, which according to Disney's own earnings report is approximately 154 million as of March 2024. This represents just 5% of the Disney Plus subscriber base. So of those that in effect have paid to watch the show, only 5% or 1 in 20 tuned in. And without the available viewing data, we can debate these estimates, but at the least it is generally agreed the show has not been a hit for Disney, with such a low proportion of subscribers viewing and it appearing to be the second least viewed show on the platform. But Datatainer, I hear you say. You said earlier The Acolyte was not an unmitigated failure, that we don't have the full story from those other hate-mongering YouTube reviews that we've seen. Well, my dear viewers, success, like many things in life, is relative. And when your point of comparison is the last Jedi-led story in the sequel trilogy, you certainly have an opportunity for improvement. And the data deconstruction in the first video for this channel, showcasing the sequels, shows how low the bar is. Using scene-by-scene analysis of time assigned to different elements and coding of success or failure for the characters, we observed the main reasons the sequels failed at the box office were a use of slapstick humour at the expense of drama and suspense, where the villains were often the butt of the joke, a lack of world building and expansion of the Star Wars galaxy, with most planets feeling like a photocopy of the ones we saw in the originals, and most of all, a lack of character arc for our protagonist of Rey, a character who near enough succeeded in everything she attempted, and how her arc missed a major reason Star Wars has endured across the generations. And that's the internal conflict in us all between the light and the dark side of the Force, between the easier, quicker, seductive path to power and the harder, longer quest for knowledge in the light. So with these data observations of the problems with the sequels, the question is, does The Acolyte fix any of them and represent an attempt from Lucasfilm to deliver a better quality, more enjoyable experience to the Star Wars fandom? Well, as a concept, it certainly had promise. When the cast and story was announced in 2022, I was really excited for the series, described by Lucasfilm as a mystery thriller that will take viewers into a galaxy of shadowy secrets and emerging dark side powers in the final days of the High Republic era. So as a concept, we had the promise of a story very centrally focused on the pull between the light and the dark side of the Force, and more directly exploring the Sith and dark side Force users. And spoiler alert for the uninitiated in The Acolyte, the story that unfolded does at least attempt to deliver on this thematic promise, where we see, in the opening episode, May, a Force user, kill a Jedi Master in Dara, and later learn her twin Osha is accused of the murder. Osha was a Padawan to Sol, and we go back in time to learn how they met, and a secret Sol is keeping about the death of her clan of witches, while Sol, Osha and the Jedi try to track down May and uncover the mystery of why she is killing Jedi, to then discover Chimere, a humble apothecary, is May's master, with the big reveal at the end that Sol killed Osha and May's mother, and this in part leads Osha to replace May as Chimere's Padawan, or Acolyte, while Sol himself is blamed by a Jedi Master Venestra for killing all the Jedi instead of Chimere for reasons we don't really know. And we close the series with the two of them looking into the distance like Luke did on Tatooine, just after we see Darth Plagueis spying on them from a dark cave and Venestra meeting with Yoda, setting up what one would think would be the next $180 million production cost to Disney of Season 2. So with that story summary in hand, the question is, how does it manifest itself in the dialogue and the themes that emerge, and how does that compare to the story focus in the sequels? Well, here we can turn to data and observation to objectively deconstruct the scripts, and in doing so step back from opinion on some of the questionable execution, which we will certainly get to. To do that, I quantified the volume of dialogue assigned to the narrative themes across the sequels and The Acolyte by using generative AI large language models. I uploaded the scripts of the sequel movies and Acolyte episodes and prompted the AI to classify over 60,000 words into story and narrative themes, to see in an unbiased way with AI what came through thematically in each story. I then analysed this script coding by looking at the differences between the sequels and The Acolyte, and this is represented in the narrative galaxy data visualization on screen. A visualization where we can see things we did not see before, by showing the story themes as planets orbiting the gravitational pull of each of the exoplanets of the sequels and The Acolyte, where the vertical distance represents the closeness of story theme to exoplanet, and the size of the story-themed planets represents the percentage amount of dialogue attributed to each theme. So let's now take a tour around the galaxy to see if the Acolyte story themes solve any of the problems of the sequels. A first observation is that narratively we can see the Acolyte is different to the sequels, with different centres of story gravity. So where do these differences appear? With the Acolyte we see that the Force, Jedi training and philosophy is central to the story, more so than the sequels. And I can see how the AI picked this up. We see a very frequent use of the Force in the series across a range of characters, and moreover a lot of discussion about the Force, its meaning and power. And this is on the one hand a good thing, but in some respects contentious and near incendiary to the fandom. On the positive side, I really welcomed the introduction of a new Sith character in Chimere, after the early demise of Snoke and what looked like desperate resurrection of Palpatine to fill the villain void. It was for me an interesting story focus to have a Force user represent the dark side and, as he said, defend his right to use his power as he saw fit. And his use of cortosis in his helmet and armour to deactivate the Jedi lightsabers, along with Torbin's Barish Vow, are genuine attempts to bring more lore into the live action of the Star Wars universe. And back to Chimere, while there were some cringy moments with him, like when he's swimming with Osha watching, for me his character brought a new angle to Disney Star Wars that they could build on. But with the good, sadly comes the bad, starting with the witch's interpretation of the Force as the thread. Now personally I didn't have a big reaction to this, but that's because it's clear to me what Disney strategically is trying to do. When we think about the originals and the prequels, the Force was the preserve of the Jedi, or a chosen one. But with the sequels, we saw a different and very deliberate strategy to change what the Force is and in a way democratize it, like when in The Last Jedi the stable boy uses the Force to grab his broom. It was a clear signal then, and it's clear now with The Thread and The Witches that Disney wants the Force to be something that is less exclusive, less narrowly focused as the preserve and the mastery of the Jedi. But it's the execution of this democratization of the Force that is both poor and frankly beyond defendable. The scene with the power of one, two, and many was so poorly executed it was like a parody of a 1970s horror movie. And it didn't stop there. We had the introduction of yet another new Force power after the self-healing nonsense in the sequels, where we discovered Chimere could wipe people's memories. I guess that could have come in useful earlier in the series when the Jedi discovered him, but whatever. And then there's Osha's near instantaneous bleeding of the Kyber crystal in Soul's saber. Yeah, it looks cool, but compare that to Vader, and when he tried to do it, he was thrown against the wall for his troubles. And that was the most powerful Jedi of all time, according to Dave Filoni. And I know most people won't care about these inconsistencies, but they make me ask, was there not somebody overseeing the production? Someone who looked at the early rushes and said, maybe we want to rethink this? Was there no quality control in the execution of what looks to me like a very deliberate strategy to continue the democratization of the Force to different users and beings? And if we move above the Force and philosophy, we see another core theme and difference for the Acolyte story about the Jedi Order implications. This was a central theme to the story, that the Jedi were as much a bureaucracy as they were an order and guardians of peace and justice in the galaxy. And again, the strategy for the story here is interesting. It moves beyond the Skywalker timeline and repetitive story of a hero's journey in Rey, like we saw with Luke, and questions the motives and management of the Jedi, which in of itself is an interesting story theme and one that could help us understand more about why the Jedi were so blind to Sidious and his plans in the prequels. But back to the poor execution, it does it in such a way that it feels like a takedown of the Jedi, and it feels frankly unjustified. Like when Senator Rayancourt comes out of nowhere and accuses the Jedi of being corrupt and too powerful. For what reason? For what motive on his part? Don't know. All we know is that the Jedi are now bad and that what you thought originally about them was wrong. That when Obi-Wan said in A New Hope that they were the guardians of peace and justice, that was all wrong. They were in fact like a police force with a commissioner in Venestra that cared more about power than protection, like when she decided to cover up that Chimere killed the Jedi and blamed Sol. And in showing Yoda at the end of the series, it felt like a cheap move to me, that in throwing him in at the end, they needed to give a reason for people to watch the second season, like they weren't confident in their own characters and narrative. And in doing so, it suggested Yoda either didn't sense what was happening to the Jedi, or he didn't care enough to step in, which is not the character that trained Luke on Dagobah in the originals or took on Dooku and Sidious in the prequels. And the same goes for the glimpse of Darth Plagueis. Most of the audience wouldn't even know who he was, and those who do know him from the Legends books are now asking why he's there at all. Is he Chimere's master? Did he create Osha and May, not the witches? If that was their intent, I guess it worked, but to me it felt too forced, like they had to throw him in and Yoda to legitimize their own story and what will happen next. So moving across the galaxy, what do we see when we look at the relationships and character development? Here we see another what I think is quite deliberate attempt by Lucasfilm to right the wrongs of the sequels, with more emotional connection and character backstories. A big problem with the sequels is they started and ended with Rey. There was no other character that really had screen time or agency. Like Finn, a great concept character set up in the Force Awakens trailer of a stormtrooper that becomes a Jedi, but as I talk about in one of my other videos, a character relegated to a mere foil for Rey and her quest. Whereas in The Acolyte, things are more evenly balanced. Yes, it's clear that Osha is the protagonist, or at times it's not, but she isn't the epicenter of the story. And other characters like Sol and Chimera are given time to breathe and for us to at least engage with other character motivations and goals. But even Venestra, while acted like a plank of wood, is given some time in the script to represent the conflicted motivations of the Jedi. By contrast, in the sequels, we see a character focused identified by the AI that was so surprising I nearly fell off my chair. One of more focus on personal growth and challenges. In my deconstruction video of the sequels, I saw a very clear trend in the data about Rey's lack of challenge or failings. Yet in this data, we see a clear centre of gravity to personal growth and challenges that can only be linked to her because she's the only character given any time on screen to have this arc. But when I looked closer at the data by sequel movie, I saw a strong skew in the dialogue percentage and the rise of Skywalker, and I think the AI classification now makes more sense. Because there are a series of moments where Rey questions herself, and we see the moment when she's confronted by a possible version of herself as a Sith. But for me, these moments felt like plants, like a recognition Rey was too perfect, too flawless in the previous movies, and it was too little too late. But that's just my opinion, and maybe you have another view about it. If so, I'd love to get your views in the comments because I'm finding this centre of gravity a hard one to explain. And at this point in our tour of the galaxy, we see the centre of gravity shift to the sequels, when we focus on humour. And on this one, I think Lucasfilm got it generally right with The Acolyte. It was a more serious show, and their use of humour with characters like Kylo Ren and Hux in the sequels really damaged the story and drama, as from The Last Jedi they were less threatening and consequential to the story and outcome. But that said, there's some near weird moments in The Acolyte that feel like a tick box exercise to include some humour when it really isn't needed, as though the producers thought that, well, things are getting a little bit serious here, so let's lighten the mood. But it's done in such a way that it's out of nowhere and derails rather than moves the story along. Like when Venestra talks about her travel sickness. What bearing does this have on the story or her character? What does this mean for what will happen next? Don't know. Or when Jackie and Osha ask if Basil is a he or a they. Likely this felt like a funny quip to include in the story, and it would be if all viewers of the series had the same political leanings as the producers of the show, but in reality most people just want a break from the grind of the world around them, and moments like this remove that suspension of disbelief. But let's just throw it in anyway to get some chuckles, I guess. And in our closing segment of the galaxy, we also see the sequels own the centre of gravity for conflict and action, especially when thinking about escapes such as when Rey saves the rebels from the First Order, and verbal confrontations like Rey and Kylo's Force FaceTime calls. But it's in the physical fights and confrontations the Acolyte has more gravity, and along with the use of the Force, it represents the highest percentage of dialogue and time in the series. And to be fair, this represents a step forward from the awful lightsaber duels of the sequels. I know the prequels were a hard act to follow, with Nick Gillard's choreography to this day holding its own and inspiring all manner of sabercons and YouTube videos. And it could be argued that characters like Kylo and Rey, being trained outside the height of the Jedi era, should not have been as adept as characters like Anakin, Obi-Wan and Darth Maul. But even that aside, the saber duels in the sequels were so bad, so full of wooden steps, so telegraphed even the general audience could see and feel it. Like the duel Rey and Kylo had in the throne room in The Last Jedi when Snoke's guards formed an orderly line to attack Rey. Or when Kylo, having turned back to the light as Ben Solo, seems to count the seconds in his head that he needs to keep his saber behind his back before fighting the Knights of Ren. So by comparison, the saber duels Kymir has with the Jedi and Soul are of a very high quality. They are fast, varied, well choreographed, and the best saber duels we've seen in the Disney Star Wars era. But let's not get too carried away here. In my view, they're still below the heights of the prequel movies, and we see as good quality if not better saber duels in fan fiction movies like Darth Maul Apprentice on a budget certainly smaller than $180 million. So credit to Lucasfilm for upping their game in this part of the experience, and hopefully we'll see more of this in future stories that get towards Gillard's masterful choreography. So at the end of the tour of the narrative galaxy, what have we learnt about The Acolyte and Lucasfilm's direction for the future of Star Wars? Well, it's clear to me from the story theme data that Lucasfilm has taken a very deliberate strategy for The Acolyte. which in itself is a positive step forward from the planning chaos of the sequels, where actors like Adam Driver openly admitted they either didn't have a plan for the whole story or switched it between directors, leading to things like the rabbit out of a hat bringing back Palpatine. And with this plan comes some solutions to the failure of the sequels, like focusing more on what makes Star Wars distinct from other franchises out there, by exploring and expanding the role of the Force and Force users, and genuinely attempting to introduce and deliver a dark side character that some of the audience now want to see more and learn more about. An attempt to give more context to the Jedi and why they've been so blind to the Sith in the prequel era. A deliberate attempt to move beyond the one-dimensional hero arc of Rey to explore a greater variety of characters and stories. And a clear investment in the saber duels and choreography. What this all amounts to is a strategy, a clear assessment of the failings of the sequels and a strategic intent with a clear plan to right those wrongs. But even if you have a group of people with a strategy and a plan, it is nothing without execution and having the filmmakers that can realise the strategy and vision. And this is where The Acolyte is rightly derided. You know, if your work is more memed than applauded, you have a problem, and the power of many seen is symbolic of that. Or the insistence to inject identity politics into a galaxy far, far away, or the simple lack of attention to detail to explain why the Senate accused the Jedi of corruption, or having the respect for your audience not to throw in loved canon characters to try and secure a second season. So is The Acolyte the totemic failure the internet and all of the YouTube reviews claim it to be? In my view, no. But is it then a success that will bring back Star Wars to its best? Well, not really, but it does at least right some of the wrongs of the sequels and represents a recognition from Lucasfilm they needed to fix things. My only hope now is that they can take the next step and execute this strategy by investing that $180 million in filmmakers who can bring their strategy to life. Filmmakers who care about Star Wars and its future. Filmmakers who have proven experience to do it. And filmmakers who will put the audience experience first to bring Star Wars back to its true self. Thanks for joining me on this tour of the narrative galaxy. Please drop a comment to let me know what you think about these differences between the sequels and The Acolyte, and what this means for the future of Star Wars. I expect I've not covered all points, and I'd love to know what you think about the data and observations. And in the meantime, remember, in the way of data and observation, we can save entertainment.